Good morning, children. Have you heard of Christopher Columbus? He was the famous sailor who sailed across the world in his ship in search of India, but instead he reached America. Children, some people are adventurous like Columbus. Then there are other people who are adventurous but only in their thoughts. One such person was Jonathan Swift, an Irishman who was very imaginative. He wrote a delightful story of a sailor who visited strange and unique lands in his quest for adventure. Gulliver's Travel, or Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver. Gulliver, who was first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships. So, the story goes like this.
I am only 42 years old. Still I have already had many strange adventures in my travels to far off the world. Strange adventures aren't what you expect from someone named Dr. Lemuel Gulliver. But being a doctor in London just didn't satisfy me. Traveling to distant lands in the world always fascinated me. So after qualifying as a doctor, I signed up as a ship's doctor and spent 3.5 years sailing around Europe. I accepted an offer from the captain of a ship named Antelope to be the ship's doctor on a voyage to the South Seas. We set sail from Bristol, England on May 4, 1699, and after peacefully crossing the South Seas, we were hit by a violent storm off the west coast of Australia. Poor food and too much work while braving the storm caused the death of 12 of our crew and weakened the rest. So, when the wind drove us onto some rocks and split the ship apart, only 6 seamen, myself included, had enough strength to get a lifeboat down into the seas and row clear of the ships and rocks. Suddenly, a strong blast of winds from the north overturned our little boat and scattered my companions. I never laid my eyes on them again. I began swimming in whichever direction the wind and the waves pushed me. I don't know how many hours I spent struggling, but just when I was completely exhausted and water seemed to be filling my lungs, my feet suddenly touched bottom. I took it several mouthfuls of air and looked up to the heaven. It must have been about 8 in the evening. The storm had decreased and there was enough light to make out land about a mile away. I spent the next 2 hours trying to drag myself towards the shore. I was so weak and tired. Finally, I limped out of the sea that I dropped down a patch of soft grass. Within moments, I was sound asleep. I must have slept for about 9 hours, for when I woke up, it was daylight. I tried to get up, but I couldn't move. My arms and legs were tied to pegs fastened into the ground. Thin, strong cords were tied across my body and attached to the pegs in the ground. My long hair was spread out and tied down in the same manner. All I could do was to stare upwards at the sun, blinking to ease the pain on my already strained eyes. Suddenly, I heard strange noises around me, but I couldn't move to find out what they were or where they were coming from. The next moment, I felt something alive moving into my leg. It progressed over my stomach and onto my chest, stopping just below my chin. I lowered my eyes downward as much as I could, hoping to see what sort of insect was crawling on me. Then I suddenly gasped. Why, it's a human creature barely 6 inches tall. This creature had a bow and arrow in his hands and was followed by 40 more creatures like him. I was so surprised that I let out a frightful roar. All the creatures ran helter-skelter and jumped off my body in terror. After some time, they gathered courage and climbed back into my body. This time, one of them even clambered into my chin and get a closer look at me. He let out a screech of excitement. Hekina de Ghoul, repeated the crowd after him. I didn't give too much attention to their words. I was more concerned with setting myself free. By twisting and turning and pulling and pushing, I managed to pull out the pegs that were holding my left arm down with one arm free. I was able to free my hair and turn my head to the right. There were cries of panic from the little creature, and suddenly hundreds of tiny arrows hit my left hand, pricking me like hundreds of needles. When arrows began striking my face, I groaned with pain and raised my left hand to protect myself. They also started jabbing spears at my sides. Luckily for me, my jacket was thick and prevented me from anything getting severely injured. I thought to myself that the wisest thing to do was to lie still until night. So I stopped struggling and the arrows stopped coming. But soon I heard another loud noise near my right ear. It was like a banging, like people at work. I turned as much as I could and saw about 50 of the creatures setting up a platform a foot and a half above the ground. Soon 4 of them climbed up the ladders and stood on the platform. In the middle was an important looking man. He made a long speech looking in my direction, and of course I didn't understand a word of it. But I could tell from the tone of his voice that some words were threats, other promises, and still other reassurances, especially when he pointed all around and repeated over and over, Lilliput, Lilliput. So I was in a place called Lilliput. Though I had never heard of such country or seen it on a map, I tried to answer the important looking man and tell him that I was a friend and meant no harm. I even raised my eyes and hands to heaven to make my promise stronger. The last time I had eaten was hours before the ship sank, so I had to show these people that I was hungry. I did it by putting my fingers into my mouth as I spoke. The great Hergo, as I later learned this important lord was called, understood my signs and shouted out orders to the crowd below. 100 little people immediately placed ladders at my sides and climbed up on my body with baskets of meat and bread, which they dumped into my mouth. This was the food that their emperor had ordered as soon as he had received word of my arrival. When I signaled that I was also thirsty, they rolled a barrel up a ladder and across my chest. Then they poured a delicious liquid that tasted like wine, but the barrel was equal to a cup. And after that they gave me a second barrel. They showed me that they had no more. I was grateful to these little creatures. They had treated me generously.